The place is Baltimore, Maryland, and the year is 1972. On a quiet residential street, a film crew looks on in astonishment as their star, a 300-pound drag queen in a loud dress and cha-cha heels, bends down to perform an act of cinematic infamy. The director, a lanky young man with a razor-thin mustache and a mischievous grin, watches approvingly. The camera rolls as Divine, the director's childhood friend and muse, scoops up fresh dog feces from the sidewalk and swallows it. The character won her competition with 2 kidnappers to prove she was the, quote, filthiest person alive, and at the same time completed the final scene of Pink Flamingos. This gag-inducing stunt would go down in the underground film legend, and it was John Waters who orchestrated this outrageous climax as a publicity stunt, one that would frighten hippies, he later explained. It was a deliberate exercise in poor taste designed to shock the world. In that moment, the 26-year-old filmmaker ensured his reputation as America's reigning prince of provocation. But what was the story behind John Waters? And how did a movie like Pink Flamingos ever end up being made? Welcome to Hollywood Mysteries. John had always prayed to what he defined as the holy trinity of Pasolini, Genet, and Warhol. These were 3 provocateurs par excellence who had waded their way through the filth to become recognized as doyens of the artistic elite. With Pink Flamingos, John eventually got his wish. In 2022, the trashy little film was enshrined as part of cinema history alongside Citizen Kane and Seven Samurai when it joined the Criterion Collection. For a director who delighted in crossing every line of decency, this mainstream high art recognition was the ultimate punchline. Nicknamed the Pope of Trash by none other than novelist William S. Burroughs, John Waters spent his career gleefully thumbing his nose at polite society. Over 50 years he went from filming no-budget transgressive comedies on the streets of Baltimore to becoming a cultural icon. He is today a dapper, wisecracking elder statesman of cinematic bad taste, but his journey was as unconventional and entertaining as his movies. A chronicle of creative rebellion, cult fame, personal loss, queer identity, and improbable mainstream acceptance. It's a story that begins, as many of his stories do, in a most unlikely setting, a conservative suburban home, albeit one being quietly transformed by a little boy's wicked imagination. John Samuel Waters Jr. was born April 22, 1946, in Baltimore, Maryland, the eldest son in an upper-middle-class Catholic family. By all outward accounts, his upbringing in the suburb of Lutherville was comfortable and conventional. His father, John Waters Sr., was a successful manufacturer of fire protection equipment, and his mother, Patricia, was a devout Catholic who dutifully took young John and his 3 siblings to Mass on Sundays. Yet beneath this polite 1950s veneer, John was already nurturing an eccentric creative spark. "I always was a weird child," he later admitted. In kindergarten, he became obsessed with a weird kid in class, who spoke to no one and drew only in black. In fact, he regaled his mother with daily reports about this odd classmate, to the extent that the worried Mrs. Waters contacted the kindergarten to find out who this strange kid was, only for the teacher to reveal that the mysterious misfit was John himself. Even as a little boy, John was crafting a secret identity and reveling in his own weirdness. One of Waters' earliest inspirations came from a seemingly innocent source, the 1953 MGM musical, Lily, in which a puppeteer's creations come to life. Enchanted by the film at age 7, John didn't start staging cute puppet shows like most kids. Instead, he devised his own extremely violent spins on Punch and Judy, and performed these subversive marionette acts at children's birthday parties. "I often look back and wonder at how understanding my parents were," Waters said later. His mother tolerated his morbid fascinations, even taking toddler John to wander around junkyards so he could, quote, "play car crash" amid the wreckage. His father, for all his horror at what John would later put on screen, made an effort to support his son's peculiar interests. Dr. Spock didn't have a chapter on how to handle your son if all he wanted to do as a child is play car crash. Yet my mom let me, Waters said, and he credited his parents for giving him the freedom to be himself. The mix of the wholesome and the ghoulish defined Waters' formative years. Raised Catholic, he was instilled with a strong sense of sin, which only made forbidden ideas more enticing. "I thank God I was raised Catholic, so sex will always be dirty," Waters quipped later in life, only half joking. He devoured comic books and remembered being oddly mesmerized by the Wicked Witch and the Wizard of Oz. "Oz opened me up to villainy, to screenwriting, to costumes, and great dialogue. I think the witch has great, great dialogue," he said. He was always drawn to the forbidden. Where other kids saw technicolor fantasy, he noticed the dark humor and fabulous depravity swirling around Margaret Hamilton's cackling witch. He also got an early crash course in schlock cinema. As a boy, he would bunk off from his private school to sneak up a hill overlooking a local drive-in theater. Binoculars in hand, he'd watch the tawdry B movies playing on the big screen. While his peers were at home watching Leave It to Beaver, John's imagination was being imprinted with visions of monsters, juvenile delinquents, and scantily clad vixens flickering in the distance. Biographer Robert L. Pella said that those nights spying on exploitation movies from afar had a greater effect on him than any prestigious art film his parents might have preferred him to have been watching. By his teenage years, John was fully embracing his identity as a local oddball and finding his tribe of fellow outsiders. At 16, he met Glenn Milstead, a heavy-set, gentle neighborhood kid who would soon become his closest friend and creative collaborator. Milstead, of course, would later be immortalized under Waters' given nickname, Divine, the outrageous drag queen who became the director's on-screen alter ego. Together in the early 1960s, John and Glenn sought out the seedier, more bohemian side of Baltimore that lurked behind the wholesome Ozzie and Harriet facade. They loitered outside Martix, a downtown beatnik bar, hoping to soak up the atmosphere of the city's artists and rebels. Too young to go inside, Waters hung around the alley, relying on older patrons to slip him surreptitious sips of gin, while he made friends in the underground scene. "It was the first time I had met people who said, 'You don't fit in? Great. We don't either,'" recalled actress Mink Stoll, who met Waters and Divine through this bohemian circuit. Finding these people really was a revelation, Stoll said of discovering the community that would form Waters' repertory troupe. Waters had found his chosen family, as he called it, the merry band who would be known as the Dreamlanders. This group, which soon included Mary Vivian Pierce, David Lockery, Mink Stoll, Edith Massey, and others, became the cast and crew for all of his early films. They were Baltimore kids on the margins, gay, weird, artsy, or just plain not fitting in, and under John's direction, they channeled their outsider energy into art that cared little for authority. By the mid-1960s, John was shooting 8mm and 16mm short films starring his eccentric cohort, and they were cheaply put together but with plenty of enthusiasm. In 1964, at age 18, he shot Hag in a Black Leather Jacket, a 17-minute surreal skit featuring an interracial hippie wedding officiated by a KKK member, an early indication of Waters' taste for the politically incorrect. His influences were an unusual mashup. He worshipped highbrow auteurs like Bergman and Fellini, but equally adored cheap gore fests and nudie flicks. Waters had stated that he takes an equal amount of joy and influence from highbrow art films and sleazy exploitation films. In his own words, "To me, bad taste is what entertainment is all about. If someone vomits watching one of my films, it's like getting a standing ovation." That ethos was already evident in his early work. After a brief and predictably disastrous attempt at college, he was expelled from NYU in 1966 after just a few months, reportedly caught smoking marijuana on campus. Waters returned to Baltimore to pursue filmmaking full-time. He and his Dreamlanders jumped right into making underground movies with titles like 1966's Roman Candles and Eat Your Makeup from 1968, the latter featuring Divine as Jackie Kennedy in a gruesome reenactment of the JFK assassination. These shorts were crude, absurd, and most importantly, wholly original, and it won the young provocateur a small local following. Waters had to hustle to get his work seen. One of his 8mm films, The Diane Linkletter Story, a dark satire about a drug-related suicide, was shown at the Baltimore Film Festival in 1970, but very few festivals or movie theaters were willing to project his films. And wherever John and company went, trouble wasn't far behind. In 1969, while filming his first feature-length effort, Mondo Trasho, Waters attempted to shoot a scene with a nude hitchhiker on the grounds of Johns Hopkins University, without permits, naturally. Campus security and Baltimore police swooped in, arresting several crew members and charging Waters and others with conspiracy to commit indecent exposure. The charges were later dropped, but the stunt became part of local legend. It also intensified John's resolve to push buttons wherever he found them. Ever committed a crime? Oh yes. He and his team would later joke about their guerrilla filmmaking days, which often involved shooting outrageous scenes on location before anyone could stop them. By the end of the 60s, John had developed a distinctive style, campy, confrontational, and defiantly cheap, and a tight-knit team ready to follow him anywhere. What he needed next was a breakthrough, something that would catapult him from Baltimore's underground art circles to national notoriety. In 1970, he made Multiple Maniacs, a gleefully blasphemous black comedy in which Divine runs a traveling cavalcade of perversion show and ends up being raped by a giant lobster. The film's provocations, ranging from rosary sex scene in a church to cannibalism, earned it some attention beyond Baltimore. One reviewer noted that Waters had managed to show on screen, quote, "two actual queers kissing each other like lovers on the lips. Years before that was at all common." But it was his next feature film, filmed on a shoestring budget of $10,000 in 1971, that truly put John Waters on the map of American culture, for better or worse. Before we get to that, I'd like to remind you all that we have a whole range of exclusive Hollywood shirts in our store, all of which are designed in-house here at Hollywood Mysteries. I love the icons of old Hollywood as much as John Waters does, and if you do too, then you might like to grab yourself one of these designs featuring figures like William Powell, Peter Lorre, Shelley Duvall, Pola Negri, and more. And also make sure to head over to the sister channel Rock and Roll Mysteries for more of the same deep dive documentaries, only on musical stars of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond. We've made videos recently on figures like the extremely tragic Sandy Denny and the murky and brilliant Dennis Wilson, so don't miss those. But let's get back to John Waters now. In March 1972, Baltimore moviegoers got their first taste of Pink Flamingos, a film proudly advertised as an exercise in poor taste. Waters had finally hit on the perfect vehicle for his obsessions. Pink Flamingos was a deranged farce pitting Divine, playing a wanted criminal hiding out in a trailer with the self-proclaimed title, The Filthiest Person Alive, against a pair of depraved suburban villains vying to steal her crown. The plot was mostly an excuse for a parade of gleefully obscene vignettes: voyeurism, a singing rectum, cannibalism, a sex scene with live chickens, and an all manner of perversion that careens towards the now infamous final gag of Divine eating dog excrement. Waters later described the film as a terrorist act against the tyranny of good taste, And indeed, he approached it with an almost punk rock militancy. To finance the movie, he convinced his skeptical father to loan him the money. Waters Sr. would be paid back with interest once the film found its audience. They knew the type of movies I made were against everything I was brought up to be, John admitted of his parents, yet still his father enabled this particular rebellion. It was a gamble by the elder Waters, essentially funding a film destined to scandalize anyone that he might have ever met or associated with himself. Scandalize it did. When Pink Flamingos opened, local curiosity seekers and counterculture types packed midnight screenings, eager to see just how far Waters and Divine would go. The film quickly became an underground sensation. In Baltimore, it sold out 9 consecutive showings in its first 3 days. And soon it spread to art theaters and midnight movie houses in New York, San Francisco, and beyond. People who never came out of their closets came out to see it, recalled one festival organizer, calling it the freak event of the year. As Waters had hoped, Pink Flamingos united the outsiders, hippies, drag queens, queer folks, punks, and adventurous college kids, into an ecstatic cult following. At the same time, it absolutely horrified mainstream critics. The responses from the press were polarized, to say the least. Interview Magazine's acerbic columnist Fran Lebowitz wrote that it was one of the sickest movies ever made, and also one of the funniest. On the other hand, Variety missed the joke. Their review thundered that Pink Flamingos was one of the most vile, stupid, and repulsive films ever made. The Detroit Free Press wrote, like a septic tank explosion, Pink Flamingos has to be seen to be believed, in what Waters proudly cites as his favorite review. Even some in the underground press were initially unsure what to make of Waters' extremity. The underground press took a while to embrace me, Waters has said, but I always knew it could be a hit if the right people saw it. The right people did see it, and Pink Flamingos became a midnight movie landmark. In the early 1970s, the concept of midnight cult films was just emerging, and Waters' magnum opus was right there at the forefront, predating the Rocky Horror Picture Show and David Lynch's Eraserhead in the late-night circuit. In fact, Pink Flamingos is cited by many midnight movie experts as being the second original midnight movie ever released, after Alejandro Jodorowsky's surreal western El Topo. Audiences at these screenings were rowdy and ready for transgression. Some theaters even handed out custom pink flamingo barf bags for viewers who might be overcome by the on-screen grossness. Waters later said he witnessed people actually vomiting during showings, the ultimate compliment in his view. Through word of mouth and scandalous reputation, Pink Flamingos went on to become the definition of a cult classic that every hip young movie buff still considers a must-see to this day. Waters would follow up with 2 more films of equally controversial nature, 1974's Female Trouble and Desperate Living, which came out in 1977. Both films featured much of the same cast as Pink Flamingos, although Divine did not appear in Desperate Living. Instead, it featured the stripper Liz Renee as Muffy St. Jacques, Mink Stoll as Peggy Gravel, and Susan Lowe as Mole McHenry, the role originally slated for Divine, who could not feature due to having already committed to a role in the Warner Brothers comedy Woman Behind Bars. It was also the first film Waters made without David Lochary, who by this time was in the dark clutches of PCP addiction. The reason that David wasn't in Desperate Living is because of PCP. That's all that's to it. I know that's why he wasn't in the film, and he knows it too, is what John said at the time. Sadly, Lochary would die shortly after Desperate Living was released, when he fatally injured himself while high on the drug. Female Trouble, on the other hand, did feature Lochary and Divine, with the latter playing Dawn Davenport, a high school girl who goes berserk when her parents refuse to buy her cha-cha heels for Christmas. She throws the Christmas tree at them and storms out of the house, half nude, before embarking on a kind of depraved quest. Inevitably, both films caused plenty of uproar in the media, The film critic team from Good Housekeeping stormed out of Desperate Living in less than 10 minutes of the premiere. The release of Female Trouble led to the now legendary line from the evidently bemused Rex Reed of the New York Times, where he wrote, "Where do these people come from? Where do they go when the sun goes down? Isn't there a law or something?" Desperate Living also landed him in hot water with gay rights groups who were particularly upset at the film's depiction of lesbianism, and his use of a defunct lesbian magazine's title for the film's name. Even the poster caused controversy. New Line Cinema backed the film and blew it up to 35mm for a midnight run, but the New York Times intervened and refused to print the original poster, a picture of a dead rat on a plate. So a new poster featuring Liz Renee screaming had to be thrown together at the last minute. By the end of the 1970s, John Waters had conquered the midnight movie circuit and became a counterculture hero. The question was, could he, should he, cross over into the broader mainstream of American cinema? Waters himself was ready for a new challenge. After you've been known as the Prince of Puke for so long, you eventually want to try something different. You want to make people laugh in a new way, he said. His opportunity came in 1981 with Polyester, a film that was a major turning point in his career. This time, Waters set out to lampoon a more universal target, suburban melodrama. Polyester is a gleeful spoof of 1950s-style women's pictures, as they were known. In John's first attempt at a relatively accessible comedy, with a strong emphasis on relatively, it still featured foot fetishism, an abortion clinic bombing played for laughs, and Divine as a downtrodden housewife addicted to inhaling glue. What really set Polyester apart, however, was Waters' brilliant gimmick, odorama. Each audience member received a scratch and sniff card numbered 1 through 10. When a number flashed on screen, viewers could scratch the corresponding spot and smell what the characters were smelling, be it roses or, in true Waters fashion, a malodorous fart. The stunt was a cheeky homage to B-movie showman William Castle, and it delighted new audiences who were otherwise unaccustomed to Waters' deranged tricks. Polyester also showed Waters extending an olive branch to Hollywood, of sorts. He cast a bona fide former teen idol, Tab Hunter, as Divine's romantic lead, a bit of stunt casting that generated buzz and signaled that even a 50s matinee idol was game for Waters' brand of putrid humor. For the first time in his career, Waters worked with a professional cinematographer and film crew, and he was able to upgrade the technical polish of his work. The film was released by a mainstream distributor, New Line Cinema, and won mostly positive reviews. Critics who had once dismissed him were surprised to find Polyester a cleverly satirical take on American domestic life that was inspired by the beautiful melodramas of Douglas Sirk. It grossed over $2 million, modest but enough to be Waters' biggest box office success up to that point. Importantly, it proved that John Waters could tone down the explicit shock just a notch and still be wickedly funny. If Polyester nudged the door to the mainstream open, Waters' next film kicked it down. In 1988, he wrote and directed Hairspray, a wild, PG-rated comedy that would make even his most ardent fans do a double take. Hairspray was, on the surface, a sweet-natured story of a plucky teenage girl in early 60s Baltimore who fights for integration on a local TV dance show. It starred then-unknown Ricki Lake as the full-figured heroine Tracy Turnblad, and featured Divine in what would tragically be his last film role, as Tracy's loving mother, Edna. The film was a loving tribute to the early 60s, complete with bouffant hairdos, upbeat Motown songs, and earnest lessons about racial equality. Families could watch Hairspray together. School teachers could even feel good about its civil rights message. This was John Waters, the once notorious smut peddler, delivering a feel-good movie with a heartfelt social message, had the world turned upside down. But Hairspray was not a sellout. Beneath its bubbly, danceable surface, Waters smuggled in his subversive sensibilities. Hairspray is the only really devious movie I ever made, he said years later. The musical based on it is being performed in practically every high school in America, and nobody seems to notice it's a show about two men singing a love song to each other that also encourages white teen girls to date black guys. Hairspray is a Trojan horse. It snuck into Middle America and never got caught. Indeed, the film's central romance between Tracy's mother, Edna, always played by a man in drag in the musical versions, from Divine onward, and her devoted husband, Wilbur, means that in the stage musical, two male actors serenade each other every night. And the film's climax, showing an integrated dance party, carries Waters' lifelong theme of outsiders triumphing over the establishment. Hairspray was Waters' biggest critical success to date. The New York Times praised it for its zany exuberance, and even the genteel New Yorker found it endearing. Audiences loved it too. The film became a moderate hit, grossing around $8 million and introducing Waters' off-kilter humor to a much broader audience. John's parents, who had politely stomached his earlier shock fests, could at last enthusiastically embrace one of his films. His father even proudly told friends about Hairspray. For Waters, seeing Hairspray connect with mainstream America might have been the most anarchic thrill of all. The ultimate full-circle moment came in the 2000s, when Hairspray was adapted into a previously mentioned Broadway musical that went on to win 8 Tony Awards and then was remade as a big-budget Hollywood musical film in 2007, starring luminaries like John Travolta, Christopher Walken, and Michelle Pfeiffer. The one-time enfant terrible of cinema now found his work being performed by singing teens on Broadway and literally taught in high schools. As he wryly noted, he had achieved the most subversive victory, infiltrating the mainstream so thoroughly that Middle America didn't realize it had been had. Yet life, like a John Waters film, has a way of mixing joy with sorrow. Just as Hairspray was being released in early 1988 to glowing reviews, Waters suffered a crushing personal loss. Divine, his lifelong friend and creative soulmate, died suddenly on March 7, 1988, at age 42, only a few weeks after Hairspray's premiere. Divine, or Glenn Milstead as he was otherwise known, had been set to enjoy his own mainstream breakthrough. He was scheduled to tape an appearance on the hit TV sitcom Married with Children the very next day. Instead, he passed away in his sleep from heart failure, and Waters was left to grapple with the loss of the person who had been the face of his films from the very start. It was very hard, John reflected years later. Divine had been more than an actor to him. He was a childhood friend, a partner in crime, an integral part of Waters' ensemble cast, whose fearless performances made those early films iconic. Waters delivered a eulogy at Divine's funeral, celebrating his friend as one of the few true originals, and promising that his legacy would live on. Indeed, Waters ensured Divine's legend grew, from writing about him in books to consulting on the 2013 documentary, I Am Divine. But the absence of his star marked the end of an era. Waters never again had a single performer who so embodied his work, though he continued to work frequently with his other Dreamlanders like Mink Stole. The late 80s were a bittersweet time. On one hand, John Waters had finally broken through and gained mainstream respect. On the other, he'd lost the actor who helped get him there. John Waters entered the 1990s riding high. Hairspray had transformed him, in his own words, from a cinematic scourge into America's favorite dirty uncle. With Hollywood suddenly paying attention, Waters' first project of the new decade was 1990's Crybaby, a campy teen musical satire starring a 26-year-old Johnny Depp. Major studios actually got into a bidding war for Crybaby, an unprecedented moment for Waters, but he wasn't going to be cleaning up his act too much for Hollywood. It's the same kind of movie. It's a John Waters film. There's puke in it, you'll be happy to know, he said during production. Indeed, Crybaby gleefully spoofed 1950s juvenile delinquent musicals, from its leather-clad drape gangs to its ironic rockabilly tunes. John took inspiration from his own Baltimore boyhood, in particular a neighborhood greaser who fascinated and terrified him as a child, to create the film's rebel hero Wade Crybaby Walker. Depp, who was eager to shed his wholesome 21 Jump Street image, was more than game for Waters' offbeat world, and he was joined by an ensemble of misfits and cult icons. Ricki Lake once more, punk rocker Iggy Pop, former porn star Tracy Lords, and even Hollywood legend in the making Willem Dafoe in a cameo as a masochistic prison guard. Behind the scenes, Crybaby was as chaotic and colorful as the film itself. The director later revealed that teenage girls laid siege to the Baltimore set to get near Depp. The steamed-up young women left lewd propositions taped to his trailer, and even offered crew members cash for a vial of the actor's used bathwater. Federal agents swooped in at one point to serve Tracy Lords with a subpoena. She was wanted in an unrelated case involving her underage porn films. And during an early table read, 18-year-old Emmy Locane, cast as the squeaky clean love interest, Allison, was so overwhelmed at the prospect of kissing Depp in front of everyone that she fainted on the spot. I don't blame her, Waters later laughed, and he was overjoyed at the absurdity of such Hollywood madness crashing into his proudly trashy universe. When Crybaby hit theaters in April 1990, the hype didn't exactly translate to ticket sales. Despite Waters' growing fame and Depp's heartthrob status, the film pulled in only about $8 million against a $12 million budget, a flop for Universal Pictures. It was Hairspray all over again in one sense. Critics were split on Waters' brand of kitsch, and mainstream audiences weren't sure what to make of his nostalgia for bad boy teen romance. Yet, as often happens with Waters' work, Crybaby refused to die. Through video rentals, it became another cult classic over the years, and it too had its own Broadway musical decades later. Waters took the long view of its underperformance. Crybaby didn't make its money back, and that was the end of the bidding wars for John Waters, he said, but he would have another shot at a studio film. If Crybaby tested the Hollywood waters, 1994's Serial Mom was Waters' full dive into studio filmmaking, albeit on his own subversive terms. This time the budget was bigger, the cinematography glossier, and the star a true A-lister, Kathleen Turner, who signed on to play Beverly Sutphin, the sweetly prim housewife with a murderous streak. Turner's involvement was crucial. Kathleen was definitely who got Serial Mom greenlit, Waters has said. As soon as he heard she was interested, he raced to her home to reassure the actress that despite his infamous past, the project was a relatively normal black comedy, a satire of true crime obsessions, not an exercise in gross-out depravity. Turner, however, was known for her risk-taking roles in movies like Body Heat and Crimes of Passion, and she loved Waters' script. On set in Baltimore, she meshed well with the director's regulars like Mink Stole and Mary Vivian Pierce, and with newer faces like young Matthew Lillard and Waters' favorite cameo accomplice, Patricia Patty Hearst, the heiress turned terrorist. She was a team player and she inspired everybody because she's such a professional, Waters said of Turner's work ethic. For all its satiric bite, Beverly bludgeons a neighbor with a leg of lamb for wearing white after Labor Day, Serial Mom has a candy-colored tone that critics later noted was eerily ahead of its time. Years before the O.J. Simpson trial or Desperate Housewives, Waters was skewering America's conflicted love affair with wholesome surfaces and violent delights. But getting Serial Mom to the screen was a battle. The film wound up in turnaround purgatory at one point. Bouncing between studios and test screenings went poorly. Executives panicked at the mix of cheery sitcom style and gory gags. In a now famous showdown, the studio demanded a new ending in which Beverly is punished for her crimes, even threatening Waters that if he refused, he'd never work again in this town. Waters, trusting his gut, pushed back. "If we do it that way, I'll never work again in this town anyway. What difference does it make?" he retorted. The film opened in spring 1994 to mixed reviews and a meager box office. Disappointing as that was, Serial Mom quickly found its audience on cable and home video. Every year, like a twisted ritual, it reappears on TV screens around Mother's Day, and it always wins fresh laughs and gasps. More importantly for Waters, Serial Mom showed that working within the Hollywood system didn't mean compromising his vision. The bigger budget and studio polish did nothing to dilute his sensibility. Serial Mom is as merrily perverse as anything Waters made on a shoestring. By the late 90s, Waters had settled into an unusual dual status. He was both a respected auteur, an elder statesman of independent film, and still the same mustachioed provocateur who delighted in outraging prudes. He maintained his home base in Baltimore, kept the pencil-thin mustache, and continued working in his beloved hometown. He also became a sought-after personality beyond his own films, hosting the Independent Spirit Awards, and even staging photo exhibits as a fine artist, which eventually earned him a retrospective at New York's New Museum in 2004. Furthermore, in 1997, he made a memorable guest appearance on The Simpsons, voicing a character named John, a gay collectibles shop owner with a slick mustache and sardonic wit, clearly modeled on Waters. The episode, titled Homer's Phobia, dealt with Homer Simpson confronting his own homophobia, and it won an Emmy. Introducing John Waters' persona to millions of unsuspecting Simpsons fans was another mainstream coup. He essentially played himself, and in doing so helped normalize queer characters on primetime TV through humor. He then set about making 1998's Pecker, which was a satire of the art world, and it took inspiration from Baltimore's working-class neighborhoods. Edward Furlong starred as the titular character, a young sandwich shop worker who gained sudden fame as an outsider photographer, much to the dismay of his family and girlfriend, played by Christina Ricci. The film was Waters' reflection on how mainstream success can be both a blessing and a curse, a theme that paralleled his own experiences with Hollywood's uneasy embrace. While Pecker was a smaller-scale project, it still carried Waters' signature irreverence, including a laundromat-owning Ricci becoming an unlikely cult figure known as the Stain Goddess. Though it received mixed reviews, with some critics lamenting its relative tameness compared to his past work, Pecker was warmly received by art house audiences and reinforced Waters' status as a chronicler of Baltimore's eccentricities. His next film, Cecil B. Demented, was an obvious play on the filmmaker Cecil B. DeMille's name, and also allowed him to expand on his fascination with the Patty Hearst story. The film featured Melanie Griffiths as an A-list actress who is kidnapped by a terrorist filmmaking group, who force her to star in their movie. Patty naturally has a cameo. On set, the cast, which included a young Maggie Gyllenhaal, fully committed to the film's anarchic spirit, even staging fake protests that sometimes alarmed real bystanders. By this time, studios had cooled on the John Waters phenomenon, not least because his films generally didn't make any money, and Cecil B. Demented was no exception following its limited theatrical release. It barely scraped $2 million back from its $10 million budget. In 2004, Waters made what would be his last feature film to date, A Dirty Shame, an exuberantly filthy send-up of America's love-hate relationship with sex. Starring Tracy Ullman as a repressed housewife who suffers a head injury and transforms into a ravenous sex addict, the film was Waters' most overtly risque work in years. Featuring Johnny Knoxville as the leader of a tribe of underground perverts, the film took aim at prudish moralists and celebrated sexual liberation with an abandon rarely seen in mainstream cinema. But A Dirty Shame ran into trouble almost immediately. The MPAA slapped it with an NC-17 rating, severely limiting its release potential. Waters refused to edit the film for an R rating, which guaranteed that its distribution would be minimal. The film floundered commercially, again earning under $2 million and received mixed reviews. While some loved it, others saw it as a desperate attempt to recapture the shock value of Waters' early work. Still, as an unapologetic return to his transgressive roots, A Dirty Shame was an emphatic full stop on Waters' feature filmmaking career, at least for the time being. If John Waters stopped making movies after A Dirty Shame, it wasn't out of a lack of ideas or energy. In fact, the ensuing years would see him as busy and as influential as ever, working across literature, performance, and visual art. Having conquered cult cinema, Waters set out to conquer the rest of culture in his own subversive way. One of Waters' major shifts was into writing. Always a raconteur and sharp essayist, he had published the cheeky memoir Shock Value back in 1981. Waters began releasing a string of books that mixed memoir, criticism, and outrageous humor. He is also a noted bibliophile and the owner of a library of some 8,000 books. In fact, his perhaps most famous quote relates his love of physical books. He said, "If you go home with somebody and they don't have books, don't fuck them. Don't let them explore you until they've explored the secret universes of books." So, with that in mind, in 2010 he published Role Models, a collection of essays profiling the eccentrics and idols who shaped his outlook, from legendary crooner Johnny Mathis to a reformed Manson family member. And yes, John had a long-standing correspondence with imprisoned Manson girl Leslie Van Houten. He advocated for her parole on the grounds that, quote, "Her crime was a long, long time ago, and she has paid her dues to society." This stance was inevitably controversial, but pure John Waters, seeing humanity in those society deems monsters. In 2014, he came out with Carsick, a hilariously bizarre travelogue chronicling his real-life adventure hitchhiking across the United States at age 66, from Baltimore to San Francisco. Dressed nattily in a suit, with a cardboard sign reading "I'm not psycho," Waters thumbed rides from unsuspecting drivers, who ended up as characters in his book, from a drug-dealing indie filmmaker to an 81-year-old farmer who lectured him on morals. One unlikely Good Samaritan was a Republican councilman who gave Waters a long ride. John joked that the man was the first Republican I'd ever vote for. The hitchhiking trip, equal parts stunt and soul-searching journey, showed that Waters still relished pushing himself into the unknown and uncomfortable for the sake of a great story. He followed that with Mr. Know-It-All, The Tarnished Wisdom of a Filth Elder, in 2019, a self-reflective book in which he dispensed witty life advice and mused on aging gracefully into his 70s. By now, Waters had embraced his role as a cultural elder, or as he prefers, Filth Elder. He even finally tried LSD again in his 70s, just to report on how it compared to his acid trips of the late 60s. The verdict: he handled it well, but decided his tripping days were best left behind him. Beyond books, Waters became a sought-after spoken word performer and monologist, essentially turning himself into a one-man show. His live act, This Filthy World, a stand-up comedy lecture about all things John Waters, toured theaters spreading his gospel of bad taste to adoring audiences. Each year, he also tours with the John Waters Christmas, a special holiday-themed performance where he shares perverse and hilarious musings on the Christmas season. Who better to roast chestnuts over an open fire of sarcasm than the man who decorates his own Christmas tree with ornaments like the mini electric chair from Female Trouble? These shows sell out routinely, proving that Waters has become as much of a performer as the actors he once directed. With his distinctively nasal Baltimore drawl and impeccable comic timing, he is a natural storyteller, able to have audiences in stitches with anecdotes of Divine's antics, or his own unlikely encounters with the famous and bizarre. Today, his physical image itself is iconic. The pencil-thin mustache, inspired by Little Richard, He first grew it as a teen to look like the only white man in America who had one. Waters has since popped up in numerous cameos in film and television, often playing twisted versions of himself or paying homage to his cult reputation. For instance, a brief role in 2004's Seed of Chucky, where he's fittingly killed by the doll, or an appearance in NBC's Law & Order SVU as, what else, a porn shop owner. By 2020, he even appeared as part of a fashion campaign for Calvin Klein. Meanwhile, the art world that once scorned him has fully embraced Waters. In addition to serving on museum boards, he has exhibited his own visual art, quirky photo-based works and sculptures that often reference classic Hollywood and Americana. And in 2023, the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures in Los Angeles opened John Waters' Pope of Trash, a comprehensive exhibition celebrating Waters' half-century of filmmaking and its impact. Perhaps the most surreal full-circle moment of all came in September 2023, when John Waters received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. The young man who once got kicked out of Hollywood screenings for grossing people out now literally has his name embedded in Hollywood Boulevard. Waters was tickled by the honor, especially by a fan's comment that with his star on the sidewalk, now he's even closer to the gutter. "It's perfect," Waters laughed, ever appreciative of the poetic justice. At the unveiling ceremony, he made sure to invite his Dreamlanders and longtime collaborators. It was as much their victory as his. They had willed into existence an entirely new kind of cinema, and here they were, being feted by the industry that once saw them as outlaws. John Waters' journey from a prankish Baltimore kid staging puppet gore shows to an acclaimed filmmaker with a star on Hollywood's Walk of Fame is one of the unlikeliest success stories in American cultural history. In the process, he didn't so much break the rules of cinema as gleefully ignore their existence. He made movies on his own terms, cheap, bold, ridiculous films that offended the pious and delighted the perverse, and in doing so blazed a trail that countless others would follow. Crucially, beneath the layers of irony and shock, Waters' work has always had a surprising amount of heart. The outsiders in his films form their own families and fight back against bullies. In Hairspray, he created one of the most uplifting, positive depictions of integration and self-acceptance in 80s cinema. Even Pink Flamingos, for all its filth, carries an underdog spirit. Divine and her household ultimately vanquish the uptight villains and dance victoriously, if nauseatingly. Waters has often said that in his youth he was inspired by The Wicked Witch, by villains and bad characters, because in them he saw a reflection of himself, the misunderstood kid who relished things society labeled wrong. In turning those villains into the heroes of his stories, he gave generations of weirdos, queer kids, artists and dreamers someone to root for. In trash, he found art. In the gutter, he found glitter. And he made sure we could all see the beauty in his wicked, wonderful world. That's about all for this episode. Why not check out our Patreon, where I have a weekly essay on some of the more obscure and strange parts of old Hollywood. For just $3 a month, you get access to them all. And I'd like to give a big shout out to all our supporters on Patreon and as YouTube members. You all make these videos possible, so thank you. Until next time, sweet dreams.